So finally we've got it. Sorry for this brief interruption and delay. This is the Hanover Medical School where I come from here, and this is the Institute of Pathology, and we already had several guests from Ala Korinevas group who work together with us in this Institute of Pathology. And what I'm going to present today is in the first part the new WHO classification, then in the second part the principles of MDS classification, and in the last part an outlook what will happen in the near future and what is already taking place at some locations with regard to MDS diagnostics. You see here the classification 2008 and 2016, the update. In former times, in the 2008 classification, we had this refractory cytopenia with unilineage dysplasia. This has now been replaced or substituted by the expression MDS with single lineage dysplasia, and the acronym is MDS/SLD. And the refractory anemia with ring-sideroblast still exists in the new update of the WHO classification, but it is split into categories. One category is MDS with ring-sideroblast and single lineage dysplasia, and as we all know, ring-sideroblast can be combined with lineage and with dysplasia and other lineages, and therefore this new category has been introduced. MDS with ring-sideroblast and multilineage dysplasia, MDS-RS-MLD. And the refractory cytopenia with multilineage dysplasia, the third category, has been renamed in MDS with multilineage dysplasia. Then let's turn to the MDS with blast increase. There are the labels refractory anemia with the excess of blast 1 and blast 2, which you are familiar with. Now it's MDS with excess blast, MDS EB1 and MDS EB2. Another category which still exists in the WHO classification is MDS with a 5q deletion, but there has been an alteration in the old classification. It was MDS with isolated deletion of 5q. Now additional chromosomal abnormalities, one additional chromosomal abnormality except loss of chromosome 7 is allowed, and it's still 5q minus syndrome, or MDS with deletion 5q. And then there is the category MDS unclassifiable, in which cases are put which do not fit in the other categories. And these are MDS with exactly 1% blast in the peripheral blood, and with single dysplasia but pancytopenia. In order to diagnose an MDS with single lineage dysplasia, you can have one lineage cytopenia or B cytopenia, but not pancytopenia. If you have a single lineage dysplasia and pancytopenia, it's MDS unclassifiable. And the third possibility to diagnose an MDS unclassifiable are not yet described chromosomal abnormalities. And then there is this new category, therapy-related MDS, because therapy-related MDS has particular features, for example, with regard to chromosomal abnormalities. So these are the new terminology, and during the next slides I will refer to this terminology and not use the older terms to which you might be accustomed. So, what are the necessary criteria to define MDS? You need two criteria which are indispensable. These are needed to diagnose an MDS. The first is cytopenia, at least in one lineage. The second is dysplasia. And dysplasia is where morphologists come into the play. Cytopenia is not any cytopenia, but cytopenia has to reach certain levels. This means hemoglobin below 10 grams per deciliter, platelets below 100,000, and the neutrophil count below 1,800 per microliter. This is defining thresholds for cytopenia with regard to MDS. If you have a clear-cut dysplasia on morphological ground, then the levels may be higher, but still it must be cytopenia. Dysplasia without cytopenia is not an MDS. And dysplasia is, of course, what we are dealing with as morphologists, either in the smears or in the bone marrow trephines and in the histology. And dysplasia we should be able to recognize, and I will refer to this. How do we classify MDS? And we classify MDS with these three criteria: this degree of dysplasia, the uni or multilineage involvement is one lineage showing dysplasia, or two or all lineages. Then is the cytopenia affecting only one lineage, two lineages, or all lineages, then it is a pancytopenia. Fourth criterion, is the presence or absence of ring sideroblast, and when ring sideroblasts are present, they have to reach a certain percentage of erythroid precursor cells. And of utmost importance, and for morphologists, is to determine the content of blasts in the bone marrow, either in cytology or histology. And this is outside of most of our expertise. These are chromosomal abnormalities which are used to classify MDS. Therefore, morphologists come into play in this, determining the blast count and the degree of dysplasia and the lineage involvement. This is what morphologists contribute to the diagnosis. And we have two sources where to make morphologic diagnosis. The one is a cytology, the other is a histology, and both have its advantages and disadvantages. For example, cytology is not able to give us information on disturbed topography, and cytology is not able to, is not so good in determining the cellularity, and hypocellularity, meaning less cells than normal, is a negative prognostic marker in MDS. In most cases, we have an increased cellularity, but in some cases we have hypocellularity, and this can clearly be better shown in histology. In addition, fibrosis can only be seen in histology. But cytology is better in determining the degree of dysplasia and determining the blast content. It's also possible in histology, but in blasts, in the smear is still the gold standard for determining the blast content in MDS. And ring sideroblasts can only be seen in smears, not in histology. Therefore, in order to achieve a good diagnosis, the best way is to combine both analysis to look at cytology as well as histology in MDS. So this is an example of cellularity. In most instances of MDS, we have a discrepancy between peripheral cytopenia and packed bone marrow, which is, shows increased cellularity. But this is due to the ineffective hematopoiesis, increased apoptosis, and so on. But in some cases, we have decreased cellularity with a hypocellular bone marrow. That means hypocellularity does not exclude MDS. We still have to look at dysplasia. And what is important, these cases with hypocellularity tend to have a worse prognosis compared to those with a hypercellular bone marrow. What else can we see in topography? We can not only estimate the cellularity, but we can get information about the location of precursor cells. For example, a typical localization of erythroid precursor beneath the bony trabecular is a sign of atypia. And this is a topographic aspect which, of course, can only be seen if we use histology. Another abnormal topography is the localization of granulocytic precursor away from the bony trabecular in the middle of the bone marrow without association with the vessel. So these are information that we get from topography, therefore histology is also of importance for making the diagnosis of MDS. So now let's turn to the different cell lineages and the criteria which we can use to establish dysplasia. As I told you already, disturbed erythropoiesis shows dislocation frequently from the center of the interspongious space to the bony trabecula, and it shows altered cellularity with an increase of erythroid islands. You see here on the right side, this is a bony trabecula, and these cells with the basophil cytoplasm, these are erythroblasts, and they, in normal circumstances, cannot be found directly beneath the bony trabecula. And if you have problems in defining this by heme staining, you can use different immunostainings against hemoglobin, or which is also very reliable, is CD71, which we use in most instances. On the cellular level, there are a couple of criteria which can be exploited to recognize maturation atypia. With regard to the nucleus, there is budding, there are internuclear bridges, then there is apoptosis with karyorhexis, and some precursors show multiple nuclei, so multinuclearity. With regard to the cytoplasm, there can be ring cytoblast, as I told you already. Then there can be abnormal vacuolization and granular or diffuse positivity for periodic acid shift stain, fast positivity. Furthermore, there is frequently megaloblastoid changes. This does not only mean a discrepancy between cytoplasm and nucleus maturation, but also a very particular fine dispersed chromatin of the erythroid precursor nuclei and dislocation, as I told you already. These are examples. Here is karyorhexis. This is lobation here as an erythroid precursor, and here is multinuclearity seen, and this is the fine dispersed chromatin, which we call megaloblastoid change. So this in cytologic smears, these abnormalities can easily be seen. But also in histology, these abnormalities are obvious, and if you look at this erythroid island here, you see these nuclear budding here, and you see, okay, I'm sorry. And you see these abnormalities of the erythroid cells here, and the disruption and budding, and with nuclei which aren't round anymore. And the erythrocytes can be recognized by the dark blue stain of the nuclei. So also in Gibbs stain of histology, the atypic erythropoiesis is obvious. So now let's turn to the dysplasia of the granulopoiesis, and these are small size of granulocytes, hypolobation, the so-called pseudo-pelga formation, hypersegmentation, as we can see it from time to time in vitamin B12 deficiency, hypogranularity, also hypersegmentation and hypolipulation, both is possible, and also a topographic aspect. This is the atypical localization of immature precursors into the middle of the interbony area, the so-called atypical localized immature precursors, or the abbreviation is ALIPS. So this shows dysgranulosis in the smear. You have these lobated nuclei, which is a typical pseudo-pelga, and you have a characteristic hypogranulation of the cytoplasm. And with regard to the histology, you see a typical localization away from vessel, away from bony trabecular, in the middle of the spaces, and here also you see these atypically localized precursor cells, 3 to 5. There are different definitions what makes up an ALIP, minimum of 5, others use 3 to 5 to define these atypical localized precursor cells in the middle of the interspongious space. This is another example. Here you can recognize the immature cells with these folded nuclei and the granulation, and there are 6 of them in the middle of the space without association with the vessel. And of course, care has been taken, because these immature dislocalized immature precursors can also be seen in reactive states. For example, after administration of granulocyte colony stimulating factor, you see here multiple immature precursors away from the bony trabecula, or when the hematopoiesis recovers from chemotherapy. So then care has to be taken, and this cannot be taken as evidence for MDS. But in the context of all the other changes, it's a very good histological marker. Now, let's switch to the third lineage, and this is the thrombopoiesis, and there we can see these dysplastic megakaryocytes, and the dysplasia of megakaryocytes as a rule is easier to recognize in histology than in smears. In general, the megakaryocytes in MDS have a smaller size. They have atypia of the nuclei with hypolobulation. They are round. And then there are multiple round single-standing nuclei of even size without these intersegmental bridges, which normal megakaryocytes will show. So here you see these typical megakaryocytes, atypical megakaryocytes, 2 more or less even round segments which are not connected. The size is considerably smaller of these megakaryocytes here. This is binucleated again. The definition of a micromegakaryocyte is that it has approximately the size of a promyelocyte. So a micromegakaryocyte is very small, but even if these are not micromegakaryocytes, they are still smaller than usual, and they are atypical. Clearly, and this can be easily seen in histology. And if you have problems in finding them with PRS stain or in Giedler stain, you can use different antibodies to show megakaryocytes and their atypia here with the single standing nuclei. You can use different antibodies, for example, CD61 or CD42, to highlight these megakaryocytes and the atypia in the bone marrow of myelodysplasia. So these are the morphological criteria which we have, and we apply these morphological criteria, we can perform classification of MDS, whether it affects only one lineage or two lineages, and this is of importance for classification. MDS with unilineage dysplasia affects in most instances erythropoiesis. Only rarely we have a unilineage dysplasia which is restricted to either the granulocytic or the megakaryocytic lineages. Especially in these cases, we have to exclude reactive causes for the atypia. And the cytopenia, I'm sorry, this is displayed, the cytopenia can affect one lineage or two lineages, but not pancytopenia, then it is MDS unclassifiable. The most frequent is the former refractory anemia, meaning that we have an anemia with a low hemoglobin or erythrocyte count. So then we have, I'm sorry, then we have these refractory anemia with ring sideroblast, which forms an own entity, and according to the new WHO classification 2016, it is subdivided in MDS with ring sideroblast with unilineage dysplasia or with multilineage dysplasia. And with multilineage dysplasia, it resembles more or less MDS with multilineage dysplasia, not the good prognosis as we have it in refractory anemia with ring sideroblasts. As I told you, ring sideroblasts can not be seen in histology, even if you make an iron stain. What you see are enlarged islands of erythroid precursors and a lot of iron storage macrophages. This could be an indirect hint or a clue to presume these ring sideroblasts, but to prove ring sideroblasts, you have to look at a smear of the bone marrow, and you have to do an iron stain. And a ring sideroblast is defined by at least 5 dots in an erythroid precursor, and these at least 5 dots have to encircle 1/3 of the nucleus. You see, in most cases here, it is completely around the nucleus, and they have to be 50% for MDS with ring sideroblast, but, and this is also altered in the new WHO classification, if you have a splice factor gene mutation of SF3B1, which is associated with the most cases of MDS with ring sideroblast, then only 5% of ring sideroblasts are required. So most cases of MDS with ring sideroblast show a mutation of this splice factor gene SF3B1. So now let's turn from the unilineage dysplasia to the multilineage dysplasia. In these cases, as it is implied in the wording, there is more than one lineage affected, and a lineage in order that the lineage is be considered as affected, at least 10% of the cells have to show atypia. And this multilineage dysplasia can be associated with pancytopenia, uni or B lineage cytopenia. And ring sideroblasts, as I told you, are allowed in this, and this is the new category MDS RS MLD. So here you see histology of MDS with multilineage dysplasia, and 2 lineages are affected. You see the atypical megaloblastoid erythropoiesis here, there, and here with this basophil cytoplasm and these apoptotic figures here, and you see these atypical megakaryocytes with a single standing nuclei and round nuclei and the smaller size. So this can easily be seen in a good histology. And here again you have these enlarged erythroid islands with atypical nuclei here, and you have these round-shaped megakaryocytes being smaller as the average megakaryocytes in the normal bone marrow. So these are examples for MDS with multilineage dysplasia. Besides dysplasia, the second most important morphological criterion that we have to consider is the blast content. And the blast content is very important for classification of MDS and for delineation of prognosis. There is MDS with blast excess 1 and MDS with blast excess 2, and both categories have different prognosis. The prognosis is worse in MDS EB2. The threshold between these categories are 5 to 9% blast in the bone marrow, or 2 to 4%, or so one is enough to establish MDS EB1, 2 to 4% in the blood. Our rods are not allowed. Our rods are allowed in MDS EB1, and if you find our rods irrespective of the blast content, it's MDS EB2. And for EB2, the blast content is higher, 10 to 90%, or in the bone marrow, 5 to 90% in the blood. Secondary AML is diagnosed when the blast content exceeds 20%. So here you see the blast with, as they appear in the Giemsa stain. Blasts have an open chromatin with prominent nuclei, and the nucleoli, open chromatin with a prominent nucleoli, and frequently you can see a delicate folding of the blasts in the granular poiesis. Here again are numerous blasts, open chromatin, and folded nuclei, and these are already more than 10% blasts in this MDS, which you can also recognize from the MDS can be recognized from the atypical megakaryocytes. And this is a blast content higher than 20%. This is already a secondary AML. You see these numerous blasts all over the place, and the threshold between MDS EB2 and secondary AML is 20% blast in the bone marrow. This does not need to say it is necessary that therapy has to take place, but we diagnose AML, secondary AML, when 20% are crossed this border. Of course, it's good to compare histology with the smears. The blast content of the smear still is the gold standard here. Blasts can easily be recognized, and here also, and 500 cells have to be counted, and the blast content has to be evaluated, and the blast content has to be related to all cells. And in the old WHO classification, there was this erythroid myeloid leukemia. When there was more than 50% erythroid cells, the blast content was related only to the granulocytic lineage. And this has changed. These cases are now considered as MDS EB2, because in all cases we relate the blast content not to one lineage but to all cells with nuclei in the bone marrow. So most of these cases which we former classified as erythroid leukemia, erythroid myeloid are now MDS with excess of blast category 2. Of course, it is helpful if we only have histology available to do immunostain to highlight the immature precursor cells, the blast, and the most frequently used antibody is CD34, and what is a particular sign for MDS is this grouping, these clusters of CD34 positive blasts in MDS, which does not occur in normal circumstances, and you can easily evaluate the number of CD34 positive cells. Care should be taken with regard to megakaryocytes, because megakaryocytes can also be stained, but they should not be included in the count. This does not mean anything if megakaryocytes are positive for CD34. This cannot be associated with any pathological state. It's just a side reaction, and one should be aware of this side reaction and avoid counting these CD34 positively labeled megakaryocytes. An alternative to CD34 is CD117. In our hands, CD117 is less sensitive than CD34 to detect blasts, and CD117 has a disadvantage to cross-react with erythroid precursor cells. And erythroid precursor cells can be labeled with CD117. So caution should be taken when using this antibody. Again, here is CD34, and you see a megakaryocyte which is labeled by this antibody. But doing immunohistochemistry with other antibodies, here in the 70 or CD34, does not substitute for counting blasts in histology or in the smears, because blast populations can be completely negative for CD34 or partly negative. So if they are partly negative, you miscalculate the percentage of blasts. And here I show you two examples. You see here blasts all over the place. This is a blast infiltrate, and you see CD34 does react with the endothelial cells, but none of these is stained. Here, only 2 or 3 cells show a positive reaction, but as you can easily see, most of the blast population, these are all blasts, are not stained. Therefore, morphology remains the gold standard to recognize blasts. CD34 staining is helpful, but it can be misleading because some blast populations are negative, or at least partly negative, and therefore you reach at a false percentage. So, another attribute which we can see when we do histology of MDS cases is fibrosis. Up to 10% of MDS cases show fibrosis, and this fibrosis is associated with a worse prognosis. It is more frequently encountered in MDS cases which show blast excess, but Dr. Bücher has performed a study in our institute, and he showed that it can occur in each subcategory of MDS, and when it is present, it means an adverse prognostic effect independent of the subtype. For example, ring sideroblasts usually have a good prognosis. When fibrosis is present, the prognosis is worse. So it is an important prognostic marker which should be considered, and therefore it is recommended to do fiber stain in MDS cases when you have a bone marrow find from these cases. Here you see a combination of two unfavorable criteria. First, it is hypocellular, this MDS, and second, it is shows increase of agurophilic fibers. This is not MPN with fibrosis because there was no spleen enlargement, and the megakaryocytic atypia cannot be seen. So now let's turn to one category which is not defined by morphology but by chromosomal analysis, by the karyotype, and this means the presence of a deletion of the long arm of chromosome 5, deletion 5q. And in the old WHO classification, that was expected to be isolated in order to diagnose this category. In the new WHO classification, there is one additional chromosomal abnormality permitted, except loss of chromosome 7. Then it's still an MDS with deletion 5. Of course, we have to separate these cases from MDS with excess of blasts. Therefore, the blast content should be below 5% or 1% the peripheral blood, and no aurods. About 10 to 50% of all MDS cases belong to this category. Patients show up with a marked macrocytic anemia and mild neutropenia, which may be present or may not be present, and in more than half of the cases, we have thrombocytosis above 450,000. Most of these cases have a particular histomorphology, and with regard to prognosis, they show a long survival, and karyotypic evolution is uncommon. There have been discussions in the lenalidomide study. This is a thalidomide derivative which can be used to treat these patients, and when the patients are treated, the anemia is resolved, and in most cases, but some patients progress to IML, and there's a matter of debate whether this has anything to do with this lenalidomide or whether this has something to do with the p53 positive clones in these 5q minus cases. So, but this is the first MDS for which a causal therapy is available. In the erythroid islands in MDS typically are enlarged, and they have this megaloblastoid change, and the megakaryocytes are small and hypolobated. Therefore, from this histological criteria, and you can guess that it might be a 5q. And another particular feature of MDS with deletion 5q is the hypoplasia of the erythroid lineage. Here you see a stain for hemoglobin, and you see only 2 erythroid islands which are stained, and this hypoplasia is very characteristic for MDS with deletion 5q. In some cases, there might be hypercellularity, as here you still see these characteristic megakaryocytes, and you also see that there is a fibrosis. Fibrosis may occur, and it worsens prognosis in these cases. This is a delicate increase of reticulin fibers in this case. And you also have to look for blasts, of course, because if you have more than 5% blasts in, or if you have 5% or more blasts in the bone marrow, it's not MDS with deletion 5q anymore, it's MDS EB1 in this case here, with this increase of CD34 positive cases. So this is the chapter dealing with the morphology. Now let's switch to the last part of my presentation, and these are chromosomal and molecular abnormalities. Chromosomal abnormalities play a decisive role in categorization of MDS because they are associated with prognosis. Let's start here at the bad end of the spectrum. If you have a complex karyotype with more than 3 abnormalities, the prognosis is very poor. A complex karyotype is defined as at least 3 chromosomal abnormalities. And a complex with only 3 abnormalities has a poor prognosis. Then there are double, meaning that 2 chromosomes are affected by chromosomal changes. Then the prognosis is poor, except the cases in which one of the affected chromosomes is 5q. Then the prognosis is good, and this is the reason why the WHO classification has been revised and isolated deletion 5q is not anymore requested, but you can combine it with the second chromosomal abnormality. So then there are single chromosomal abnormalities with an intermediate risk, and then there are some chromosomal abnormalities with a very good prognosis, and if a deletion of the Y chromosome or deletion LFQ or deletion of 20q is present and you don't have morphological dysplasia, then this atypia does not prove MDS. In all the other cases, this chromosomal abnormality will prove MDS even when the dysplasia is moderate or not visible or affects less than 10% of one lineage. But if you have less than 10% cells affected by dysplasia or no dysplasia at all, and you find these chromosomal abnormality, it's not MDS. This does not prove MDS. So chromosomal abnormalities help us to establish clonality of hematopoiesis, and of course they are important to subdivide MDS into prognostic categories, and these prognostic categories are important to choose the right therapeutic option. On the one hand, in low risk MDS, we have growth factors, we have lenalidomide, we have azacitidine, which inhibits the gene methylation, and for higher risk MDS, there can be transplantation either of stem cells or of the complete bone marrow, and there also azacitidine can be applied or chemotherapy in these cases. Besides chromosomal abnormalities, there are numerous other factors which are combined for scores, cytopenia, and age, and so on. So this is too complicated to demonstrate it in detail here. The principle is that several items are combined. Fibrosis or hypocellularity are not a criterion in any of these international prognostic scoring systems, including the international prognostic scoring system. So, a couple of years ago, there had been a tremendous progress when it was 2008, 2009, when it was discovered that in MDS cases, there are mutations which predominantly affect splice factor genes. Splice factors are important for processing of the RNA which is a transcription of genes and then is transported to the cytoplasm, and from these RNA, proteins are produced, as you know, and for this transcription, the RNA has to be spliced, and there are a couple of splice factors, and these splice factors listed here, SF31, you have heard already, this is mutated in MDS with ring sideroblast, SSF2 and U2AF1 and 3. These are frequently mutated in MDS, and SF3B1, for example, in MDS with ring sideroblast. This gives you a list of these genes which are mutated in MDS. There are some genes which are mutated more frequently, for example, SF3B1 in most cases of this ring sideroblast MDS, and others which are only rarely affected. But in the end, 90%, more than 90% of MDS cases have at least one mutation. So with chromosomes, we see only about 40 to 50% which show clonal abnormalities. But if these genes are analyzed, then it's more, it goes up to 90 or even higher. And it's very heterogeneous, the function of the genes which are affected. We have genes involved in signal transcription, transduction, and transcription factors. We have the splice factor genes, and many genes deal with gene methylation. So the azacitidine therapy seems to be more or less related to a pathophysiological feature. For example, IDH1 and IDH2, or DNMT3, it's a DNA methyltransferase, which is also mutated. So the presence of these mutations, MDS, mean that we can use them to discriminate reactive changes showing dysplasia, showing cytopenia from clonal hematopoietic neoplasms which show these mutations. So this is a real progress in the diagnostic field. And some of these genes are really huge. For example, TET2, the mutations are divided about 17 exons, and this cannot be done with usual sequencing techniques. Therefore, we need next generation sequencing, and we have constructed a panel of genes which can be applied on a routine basis for diagnostic, and they include TET2, SF2, and a couple of other genes, 25 genes. And here you see that most of these genes are mutated not in a single locus, but they are combined. For example, SF2 mutation is frequently combined with TET2 mutation. So there is not a single abnormality in most cases of MDS, but two or more genes are mutated in these manifest MDS cases. I hope you can read this, and it's rather small. And here you see 125 patients which we analyzed, and just look at these TET2. This is a first row, and you see that these patients are all TET2 mutated, and in most of them you find additional mutations. They have a colored square below. So here, all these cases have at least an additional mutation. And here these do not show additional mutation, but here two alleles of the TET2 gene were mutated. So this helps us in discriminating it from clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate significance, the so-called CHIP is the abbreviation, because some investigators found when they look into blood of elder individuals, they found mutated genes, and just these genes, for example, TET2 can be mutated, ASXL1 can be mutated in normal individuals, and therefore it is questioned whether it is useful to use this for diagnosis of MDS. But in these cases with CHIP, the allelic burden is very low, and they are not occurring in combination with several genes mutated, as we found in our MDS cases. And there's been a recent paper on CMML, and CMML was described as a MDS MPN of elder individuals with accumulated mutations. Most of the patients had more than 7 mutations. So this is can be used to discriminate it from CHIP. Use the allelic burden, which should be above 10%, and the combination with other mutations. So to finish, I will show you some examples and which demonstrate our understanding of these MDS and MDS MPN, which are a combination of molecular defects. And as I just showed you, most of the cases had not only one defect, but several. And these defects can be synchronously present or metachronically present. And I'm going to show you 2 cases where these molecular aberrations, mutations, occurred in a metachronic fashion. The first case is a CMML, typical CMML. Here you see brownish the unspecific esterase, which highlights the increased monocytes in the smear of the bone marrow, and you also see here all these increase of monocytes in these bone marrow smear. This was 2013, and And 2013, the bone marrow looked like this. You also see here in histology the increase of monocytes. Then 2 years later, there was a dramatic change in histology. For example, compare this megakaryocyte here, which is quite typical for CMML, reduced in number and small. And now we have an increase of megakaryocyte numbers, and they are also much larger than this one here. And these megakaryocytes more or less resemble megakaryocytes which we see in MPN. What is behind this phenotypic change? And also in 2015 we had an increase of fibers here, and you see here this cluster of megakaryocyte, which is quite typical for MPN and not for CMML. What is behind the phenotypic evolution of this 77-year-old lady? In first biopsy in 2013, we diagnosed CMML. She had a TET2 mutation affecting both alleles. Again, it's a combined. And then she had the mutation of the splice factor gene SASF2 in 53%. And as we have shown a couple of years ago, about 20% of PMF cases also have SASF2 mutation, and these are cases which more rapidly progress to thrombocytopenia. So SASF2 is present in CMML and in PMF. So this does not explain the morphological transition. Then we have CBL and MPL. This is a thrombopoietin receptor. In 2013 showed wild type. And then came the follow-up biopsies up to 2 years. And you see that first there was a minor clone with a thrombopoietin receptor mutation, and then it progressed to up to 30% of cells, whereas the TET2 mutation and the SF2 mutation remained stable. So the particular appearance of this disease, a combination of MDS features and MPN features, is due to a combination of mutations, which can explain us the morphological heterogeneity. Another case, that's the other way around. This is a case which presented as typical myeloproliferative neoplasm with involvement of the spleen, 1,500 grams, and a lot of extramedullary erythropoiesis in the red pulp. At presentation 2011, we had the leukoerythroblastic peripheral blood picture, 2012 also, and then 2013 there was a change, dramatic increase of leukocytes in the peripheral blood from 9,000 to 15,000, and now we had immature precursors, promyelocytes, myelocytes, more than 10%, and increase of leukocytes above 13,000 and more than 10% immature precursors. This is what we see in atypical CML. And what is behind this transition from MPN to an atypical CML-like disease? It's the acquisition of an additional mutation. At presentation as MPN in 2011, we had a number of mutations, SASF2 mutation, and 40% of alleles, ZBP1 mutation, and no JAK2, no LPL, no calreticulin mutation, but an ASXL mutation was also present. And these mutations persisted in 2013 when we had this atypical CML-like picture shown here. This is 2011, this is 2013, and what is new and what is behind this histology, this increase of leukocyte counts, this left-shifted blood picture, is the acquisition of a mutation of the CSF3 receptor, which was not present before, but was present when this phenotypic change occurred. So the message from these two cases is that in most instances of MDS and MDS-MPN, several defects are combined. And in most instances, this is a synchronous combination. Sometimes it may be metachronic, and the phenotype may change, as I showed you in these two cases. But we have to appreciate MDS and MPN as a combination of effects which could explain the tremendous heterogeneity of cases. So let me summarize. I hope I'm in time, but not completely, I'm sorry. Summary is, we have a new WHO terminology, MDS, single lineage, MDS dysplasia, MDS RS with single lineage dysplasia, multilineage dysplasia, and so on. We have MDS with deletion 5q and this new definition that other chromosomal abnormalities, at least one, are allowed. We have, instead of refractory anemia of excess of blast, we have MDS EB1 and EB2. Morphology with dysplasia and blast content remains the gold standard for diagnosis. Karyotype is important for risk evaluation. Mutation analysis can be used to prove clonal hematopoiesis and exclude reactive states, and this can be easily used for discrimination. And the prognostic significance of these new mutations remain to be shown. There are only few studies showing that many of them have a worse prognostic impact. That's my message, and let me finish with thanking you for your patience and your attention. And I also would like to thank my co-workers in the Institute of Pathology and many clinicians who contributed with clinical data to our presentation. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, профессор Крейпе. Коллеги, какие вопросы будут? Что мы можем спросить? Клиницисты в аудитории, пожалуйста.
Ничего не сказали о циклоспорине. Лечение рецептов, в принципе, по циклоспорину.
Микрофон, я понимаю. Сейчас мы будем передавать микрофон, наверное, потом переводчик.
Лечение упомянули очень кратко. Может быть, хотя бы несколько слов об эффективности циклоспорина в вашей практике.
Could you translate? Yeah. So the question was whether cyclosporine can be useful. It has been shown to be useful in hypoplastic MDS, which partly overlap with aplastic anemia. And as you might have noticed, there has been a report that about 30% of aplastic anemias have mutations. Therefore, I think there is a proportion of cases which are considered to be aplastic anemia are MDS cases, and as you know from the algae large granular lymphocytic lymphomas, which lead to granulocytopenia, there is frequently tremendous dysplasia in the granulocytic lineage, but this is due to the reactive infiltrate of these atypical lymphocytes. Therefore, in these hypoplastic cases, it could be helpful to suppress T-cell response.
Does the rule T, LGL, and MDS hypoplastic variant occur both as components, not as,
yes,
as a reaction, but both diseases?
I guess there are some cases, but it's rare. First of all, if you see dysplasia in the context of an LGL lymphoma, you rather attribute this to the lymphoma than to the dysplastic.
Yeah. And concerning 5 minus MDS, the count of blast cell 1, 2, and 3, 5 as for treatment useful, does it will be included in adapted.
So what is the discussion is not with regard to the blast count, whether lenalidomide is suitable or not, but whether P53 is mutated or not. And many clinicians request P53 staining to be done in order to recognize the cases which will more rapidly progress to AML when lenalidomide treatment takes place. This is a work from Leonie Saft from the Karolinska Institute. She's a pathologist, and she has found out that 3 to 5% P53 cases were present in those cases which later on lenalidomide progressed to AML. So P53 is of importance, I think.
Спасибо за ваш доклад. У меня такой вопрос. Если у больной, извиняюсь за мой голос, можем ли мы диагностировать МДС-МПЗ, если в трепанобиопсии описывается и выявляется гипоплазия краеотворной ткани?
May you translate?
Is it possible to diagnose MPN, MDS, MPN when we see hypoplasia in trepine biopsy of the bone marrow?
MDS, MPN means that at least one lineage shows cytosis. And usually if you don't have cytosis, you have a hypoplastic bone marrow. So MDS, MPN means a combination of dysplasia and cytopenia plus an increase of counts in at least one lineage. So 5q minus would be an example for this, but 5q minus traditionally is categorized as MDS or not as MDS MPN.
If platelets more 500, but in bone marrow hypoplasia.
Hypoplasia. For the categorization of MDS MPN, the blood count is important, and this could be a discrepancy that the bone marrow morphology does not reflect the peripheral counts. This can have several reasons. For example, you have these subcortical spaces, but in most instances, when you have hypoplastic bone marrow, you have pancytopenia and not increase of one lineage. And this is requested for MDS, MPN, either granulocytosis or thrombocytosis.
Спасибо. И еще вопросы? Да, пожалуйста. Давайте вопросы делайте.
Вопрос основан на клиническом случае, но вот мне бы интересно, как бы диагностировали вы у пациента на основании моногистохимии лимфоузла трепанобиопсии.
Based on histochemical study of lymph node biopsy and trephine biopsy.
Выставлялась П крупноклеточная лимфома, богатая клетками.
DLBCL, T-cell rich B-cell lymphoma, large B-cell lymphoma was diagnosed.
In this one of my cases? No.
No.
It's another case, okay. So from the bone marrow, I would not diagnose T-cell rich B-cell lymphoma because in many instances you have a T-cell rich infiltrate in diffuse large B-cell lymphomas which go into the bone marrow. And what shows typically the feature of T-cell rich B-cell lymphoma in bone marrow is lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin. In rare cases, this can infiltrate the bone marrow, and this typically looks like T-cell rich B-cell lymphoma. Therefore, be careful diagnosing T-cell rich B-cell lymphoma from bone marrow. This could be very diverse. It could be nodular paragranuloma, as Lennart has termed it, or lymphocyte predominance Hodgkin, or it could be diffuse large B-cell lymphoma.
Проблема-то в том, что у пациента клинический миелодиспластический синдром, цитологически дисплазия выявляется.
cytologically it fits criteria of MDS.
Иммунофенотипически
Has she been treated? Has she been treated previously?
Лечение было?
да. Нет, ранее вот он поступает вот с такой картиной. Было принято лечение лечить все-таки
It's
лимфому,
on
в чем
admittance to the hospital for the first time.
а МДС выносился как вторичные проявления.
It could be combined. If it's an older individual, it would not be a surprise when two diseases are combined. Yeah.
То есть вы бы считали, что два заболевания параллельно?
The myelodysplasia was around the infiltrates in histology, or was it in smears? Where was it? Because if bone marrow is infiltrated, you have, for example, proliferation of megakaryocytes. This is an infrequent error that you diagnose MPN due to the increased shape of megakaryocytes, which is due to lymphoma infiltration. Therefore, there are some dysplastic features which can be explained by lymphoma infiltration, but ring sideroblasts, for example, cannot be explained by lymphoma infiltration, or small megakaryocytes cannot be explained. So it depends on the dysplastic feature.
Dysplasia was diagnosed in the smear.
So probably it's two diseases.
The fine biopsy was positive for B-cell lymphoma.
So it depends on the kind of atypia, which was on which the diagnosis of MDS was based. Yes, is it blast increase? Then it is independent of lymphoma infiltration. Is it ring sideroblast? And it's independent of lymphoma infiltration. So it cannot easily be answered. But if you use molecular, it will be possible. You can, with 90% probability, we will detect mutations which are specific for MDS. If you send us a bone marrow smear or a slide, we will look for this. And we decide the question.
Спасибо большое.